I spent an afternoon a few years back with a man who just turned 52, successful career, had built up about $600,000 in retirement savings. Felt like he was finally getting control of his finances. And he was anxious, almost frantic about what he should do next with his investments. Should he shift to dividend stocks, move into bonds, hire a financial advisor to actively manage his portfolio? He'd been reading articles, watching videos, getting advice from friends, and every source seemed to contradict the last one. After listening to him for about 20 minutes, I stopped him and asked a different question. How much was he actually saving from his paycheck every year? He paused, did some mental math, and said probably around $30,000, maybe a bit less. That's when I told him something that seemed to disappoint him at first. The essential investment move for his 50s wasn't about picking better stocks or finding some optimal allocation strategy. It was continuing to save aggressively every single month without fail. And the move he should skip entirely was constantly tinkering with his portfolio, trying to optimize returns he couldn't control. He wanted sophisticated advice about investment strategy. What I gave him was simple advice about behavior. And honestly, that's what most people in their 50s need to hear. Here's why this matters so much. When you're in your 50s, you've typically got about 15 years until retirement, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more. That's not a lot of time in investment terms, but it's also not nothing. And here's the crucial part. The money you save and invest during those 15 years will often end up being as large or larger than everything you accumulated in the previous 30 years combined. Let me show you the math on that. Suppose you started saving at age 25, putting away $10,000 a year, roughly $830 a month. By 50, you've contributed $250,000 of your own money. With reasonable investment returns of around 8 or 9% annually, that's probably grown to maybe $450,000 or so by the time you hit 50. That quarter century of disciplined saving built a solid foundation. Now suppose you increase your savings to $25,000 a year in your 50s, about $2,000 per month. Over the next 15 years, you'll contribute another $375,000. But that money has much less time to compound compared to the money you invested in your 20s. Even so, with contributions and growth, you might add another $700,000 to your portfolio. So the 15 years from 50 to 65, even with less compounding time, added more to your final nest egg than the 25 years from 25 to 50. The contributions matter enormously during this decade, more than they ever did before. You're earning more, you have more capacity to save, and every dollar you can put away has meaningful impact. This is the essential move. Maximize your savings rate during your peak earning years. Not just contribute to your 401k, but actually maximize it. The contribution limit for 2025 is around $23,000 for people under 50 and around $30,500 for people 50 and over with catch-up contributions. If you're not hitting those limits, or at least getting close, that's where your focus should be. I knew a woman who really embraced this in her early 50s. She'd been contributing about 12% of her salary to retirement accounts, which was decent, but not maximum. She was making around $140,000 a year. So 12% was about $17,000 annually. She felt good about that, better than most of her peers. At 53, she sat down and figured out what it would take to max out her contributions. With the catch-up provision, she could put in about $30,000. That would mean finding an extra $13,000 a year, about $1,000 a month. It seemed impossible at first. Where would she find that money? She went through her expenses systematically. She was spending about $600 a month on a car lease for a vehicle she barely drove since she worked from home. She let the lease expire and bought a used car for cash. That freed up $600 monthly. She was paying for a gym membership she used maybe twice a month, $90. Canceled. She had 3 streaming services she barely watched. Another $60. She'd been getting her hair done at an expensive salon every month. Started going every 6 weeks instead and found a cheaper but perfectly good stylist, saving about $100 a month. She looked at her grocery spending and realized she was throwing away food constantly, buying things she never cooked. She got more intentional about meal planning, cut her grocery bill from $800 a month to about $500 without feeling deprived. She'd been eating lunch out most days, even working from home, $50 a week. Started making lunch at home instead. None of these changes individually felt like a big sacrifice. She barely noticed most of them after the first month. But collectively, they freed up about $1,200 a month. Combined with a small raise she got that year, she was able to max out her contributions. She kept that up from 53 to 65, contributing about $30,000 a year for 12 years. That's $360,000 in contributions. With growth, that 12-year push added about $600,000 to her retirement savings. Meanwhile, her friends who kept contributing at the same comfortable rate they'd always done added maybe $250,000 over the same period. The difference between maxing out and contributing comfortably during those 12 years was about $350,000. That's not a rounding error. That's the difference between a tight retirement and a comfortable one, between worrying about money and having security. And here's the thing. She didn't do anything sophisticated with the investments. Just put the money in a target date fund and forgot about it. The power was in the contributions, not in brilliant investment selection. She wasn't picking stocks, timing markets, or doing anything clever. She was just systematically moving money from her paycheck into her retirement account, month after month, year after year. Now, I can already hear the objections. Not everyone can max out their retirement contributions. If you're supporting kids in college, dealing with elderly parents, have a mortgage, and all the expenses of life, coming up with $30,000 a year might not be feasible. Maybe your income isn't high enough to make it possible without severe lifestyle disruption. Fair enough. But the question is, how close can you get? If you're currently saving 10% of your income, can you push it to 12%, 15%? Every percentage point matters during this decade. Even going from 10% to 13% might mean an extra $200,000 by retirement. The way to find that money is usually not through some dramatic lifestyle change. It's through dozens of small adjustments. Maybe you don't replace the car this year. Maybe you skip the premium cable package. Maybe you eat out twice a week instead of 4 times. Maybe you take a smaller vacation or vacation differently. Maybe you shop at a cheaper grocery store or buy generic instead of name brand. None of these individually feel like sacrifices, but collectively, they can free up $5,000 or $10,000 a year. I watched someone do this systematically. He was 54, making about $110,000, wanted to boost his savings, but felt completely stretched. His wife worked part-time, making about $30,000, combined income of $140,000, which should have been plenty, but somehow they were living paycheck to paycheck and only saving about $15,000 a year for retirement. So he spent a weekend going through every expense with his wife. They made a list of everything they spent money on. Then they went through the list, asking one question for each item. Does this actually make our lives meaningfully better? They found $60 a month in subscriptions they barely used, another $150 on the gym membership he visited twice a month when he could walk in his neighborhood for free, $300 on a car lease when he could have driven his paid-off car a few more years, $40 in fees on checking accounts that had free alternatives, $200 on premium cable channels they rarely watched. They were spending about $400 a month on their kids' activities and lessons, which seemed necessary until they asked the kids which ones they actually enjoyed. Turned out the kids were doing some activities mainly because they thought their parents wanted them to. They cut back to the activities the kids genuinely cared about, freed up $150 a month. He was spending about $200 a month on lunches out at work. Started packing lunch most days, saved $150. They were doing a major vacation every year, costing $6,000. They decided to do a driving trip instead, cut that to $2,000, saved $4,000 annually, about $330 a month. He found about $800 a month in expenses that weren't actually making his life better. That's nearly $10,000 a year. Combined with some modest income growth and being more intentional about tax refunds and bonuses, he increased his retirement contributions from $15,000 a year to $24,000. Not quite maxed out, but close. And over the next 11 years until retirement, that difference compounded into about $240,000 additional savings. The beauty of this approach is that once you make the cuts, you adapt. After 2 months, you don't even remember or miss most of what you eliminated. It just becomes your new normal. And every month, that extra money goes into your retirement account automatically, building your future security. So that's the essential move. Save as much as you possibly can. during your 50s. Push yourself beyond what's comfortable. Make trade-offs, delay gratification, because these contributions have more impact on your retirement security than anything else you'll do with your investments. Now let me talk about the move to skip. Constantly adjusting your investment strategy, trying to optimize returns. I see this all the time with people in their 50s. They've accumulated a meaningful amount of money, maybe $500,000 or more, and suddenly they're obsessed with investment strategy. They've got enough money that small percentage differences feel significant. 1% of $500,000 is $5,000, 2% is $10,000. They start thinking that if they could just improve their returns by a couple percentage points, it would make a huge difference. So they start moving money between stocks and bonds based on market forecasts. They're chasing performance, buying last year's hot funds. They're trying to time the market, going to cash when things look scary and jumping back in when they feel confident. They're picking individual stocks based on tips from friends or articles they read. They're convinced that if they can just pick the right investments, they can make up for not saving enough earlier. Here's the reality. You probably can't improve your returns enough through active management to make a meaningful difference, and you'll probably make things worse trying. The difference between a decent, boring investment approach and a sophisticated, actively managed approach might be 1 percentage point annually, maybe 2 if you're lucky and skilled. But the friction costs, the taxes from trading, the mistakes from trying to time the market, and the time and stress involved often eat up any potential gain. Let me give you an example with real numbers. Suppose you got $500,000 invested at age 55. You're getting 9% annual returns from a simple, diversified portfolio of low-cost index funds. By 65, that's about $1.2 million, plus whatever you contributed along the way. If you contributed another $15,000 a year during that decade, you'd end up with around $1.7 million total. Now, suppose you think you can do better through active management. Maybe you pick individual stocks, trade more frequently, try to time the market. And let's say you're actually good at it and beat the market by 1 percentage point after all costs, getting 10% instead of 9%. By 65, your $500,000 grows to about $1.3 million instead of $1.2. With your contributions, you end up with about $1.8 million instead of $1.7. You made an extra $100,000 through your skill. Sounds good, right? Except that $100,000 took enormous effort. You spent probably 10 hours a week researching stocks, watching the market, reading financial news, making decisions, dealing with the stress of picking right or wrong. That's 500 hours a year, 5,000 hours over the decade. You essentially worked a second part-time job to make that $100,000. That's $20 an hour for your effort, and that's assuming you actually beat the market, which most people don't. Studies consistently show that active investors underperform passive investors over time, primarily because of trading costs, taxes, and bad timing decisions. The average active investor underperforms the market by about 2 percentage points annually, not beats it by 1. So more realistically, your active management approach might leave you with $1.5 million instead of $1.7, costing you $200,000 for all that effort. Now compare that to the alternative. You keep the simple portfolio. Don't spend any time on investment selection, and instead spend that time and mental energy on your career. Maybe you put that effort into getting a promotion or a raise. Maybe you improve your skills through training or certifications and become more valuable at work. Maybe you network more effectively and create opportunities. Maybe you just reduce your stress, sleep better, and make better decisions across your life because you're not consumed with portfolio management. If that additional focus on your career results in even a $5,000 raise, which seems modest, that's another $5,000 you can save annually. Over 10 years, contributing an extra $5,000 per year with compound growth might add $150,000 to your retirement savings. You've made more from the raise than you would have from trying to beat the market with less risk and less stress. And that's just one raise. Career advancement over a decade could easily mean $20,000 or $30,000 in additional annual income, which if saved would dwarf any potential gains from investment tinkering. I knew a man who learned this lesson the hard way. In his early 50s, he became convinced he could beat the market by picking individual stocks. He'd always been interested in business, read the financial press, felt like he understood what made companies successful. He decided to take a more active role with the $600,000 he'd accumulated. He spent 10 to 15 hours a week reading annual reports, following market news, analyzing companies, watching CNBC. He was smart, he was diligent, and for the first 2 years, he actually did pretty well, beating the market by a few percentage points. That success made him confident. He thought he'd found his calling. Then he got cocky. He concentrated his portfolio on his best ideas instead of staying diversified. He made some big bets on companies he thought were undervalued. A couple of them worked out, but a couple didn't, and the ones that didn't work cost him more than the winners gained. He sold during a market dip thinking he'd buy back lower, but the market recovered faster than he expected. He tried to rotate into different sectors based on economic forecasts that turned out to be wrong. By the time he reached 60, his portfolio had underperformed a simple index fund by about 15%. On a starting balance of $700,000, including contributions, that's over $100,000 lost compared to just buying and holding a boring, diversified fund. He'd spent hundreds of hours trying to beat the market and ended up significantly behind where he would have been doing nothing. He told me later that the worst part wasn't even the money, though that stung. It was the stress, the obsession, the way it consumed his mental energy for nearly a decade. He'd wake up thinking about his positions, check prices multiple times a day, agonize over every decision. He snapped at his wife when she'd interrupt him while he was researching. He missed family events because he was glued to his screen during trading hours. Meanwhile, his friends who just set up automatic investments and ignored their portfolios were sleeping fine and doing better financially. That's what I mean by skipping this move. Don't let the portfolio you built become an obsession. Don't convince yourself that you need to become an expert investor to succeed. You don't. What you need is a reasonable allocation, a low-cost implementation, and the discipline to leave it alone. Here's what that reasonable approach might look like in your 50s. You probably got 10 to 15 years until retirement, so you still need growth. That means a significant portion should still be in stocks, maybe 60 to 70% depending on your risk tolerance and other income sources. The rest can be in bonds or more conservative investments to provide some stability and reduce volatility as you approach retirement. You might use a target date fund that automatically adjusts over time, becoming more conservative as you approach your target retirement year. These funds are simple, diversified, low cost, and require zero ongoing management from you. Or you might build a simple portfolio of a few low-cost index funds, a total stock market fund for domestic equities, an international stock fund for global exposure, and a bond fund for stability. You decide on your target allocation, maybe 60% domestic stocks, 20% international, 20% bonds. You rebalance once a year when things drift, maybe twice if the market moves dramatically. And otherwise, you ignore it. That's it. No stock picking, no market timing, no constant adjustments, no reading of financial news or economic forecasts. No trying to predict which sectors will do well or whether technology or healthcare or energy is poised to outperform. Just a sensible allocation that you stick with, contributing consistently, letting time and compound interest do the work. Boring, but effective. The time you're not spending managing your portfolio can go to things that actually move the needle. Advancing your career to increase earning power. Reducing expenses to boost savings rate. Planning for healthcare in retirement. Understanding Social Security. Claiming strategies. Figuring out if you should pay down your mortgage or how to handle your pension options. Dealing with estate planning and making sure beneficiaries are current. All of these have clearer payoffs than trying to pick winning stocks. Now, I should address one exception to this guidance. If you genuinely love investing, if analyzing businesses and following markets is a hobby you'd do anyway, something you find intellectually stimulating and enjoyable, then fine, spend time on it. But be honest about whether you love it or just feel obligated to pay attention because you got money at stake. Most people fall into the latter category. They're not enjoying the process, they're just anxious about it. They feel like they should be doing something, managing actively, staying on top of things, but that feeling is often counterproductive. It leads to overtrading, to making changes for the sake of making changes, to second-guessing perfectly reasonable strategies. If that's you, Give yourself permission to simplify. Put your money in a target date fund or a simple 3-fund portfolio, set up automatic contributions, and go live your life. The relief of not worrying about it will be worth more than any marginal return you might squeeze out through active management. There's another piece to this that matters in your 50s. The decade from 50 to 60 is often the highest stress period of your career. You're probably in a senior role with significant responsibilities. You might be managing people, dealing with office politics, facing pressure to perform. You might be dealing with aging parents who need care or financial help. You might still have kids at home or in college, dealing with all the complexity that brings. You've got a lot competing for your time and attention, and adding constant investment management to that mix is usually counterproductive. It's one more thing creating stress without necessarily adding value. Simplifying your investments, setting them on autopilot, gives you mental space for the things that actually require your active attention. I remember talking to a woman in her late 50s who had been spending hours every week managing her portfolio. She was exhausted, stressed about everything, feeling like she could never keep up with all her responsibilities. I asked her what she'd do with that time if she wasn't managing investments. She said she'd probably spend more time with her grandkids, who she barely saw because she was always busy. Maybe finally take that painting class she'd been thinking about for years. Maybe just sleep more and feel less overwhelmed. She was sacrificing things she valued for something that was making her miserable and probably not even helping her returns. Once she simplified her approach, moved everything to a target date fund, and stopped checking her accounts constantly, she told me she felt like she'd gotten part of her life back. The irony was that her returns actually improved slightly after she stopped trying to manage actively, because she wasn't making emotional decisions anymore. That's the hidden cost of excessive investment tinkering. It consumes mental and emotional energy you could be spending on things that actually matter. And in your 50s, when time is getting precious and you can see retirement on the horizon, that energy is too valuable to waste. Let me bring this back to where I started, with that man who was anxious about his investment strategy. After our conversation, he made some changes. He simplified his portfolio to 3 index funds, 60% total stock market, 20% international, 20% bonds. He set up automatic contributions to max out his 401k, which meant going from his current $30,000 to about $31,000 by finding an extra $1,000 in his budget. He stopped reading investment news daily and cut back to a quarterly check-in just to verify everything was working properly. And he redirected that mental energy to his career. He'd been passed over for a promotion the previous year and had been bitter about it, but he hadn't done much to position himself better. He started being more proactive, taking on higher visibility projects, networking more within the company, improving his skills through online courses. 18 months later, he got promoted. The promotion came with a $20,000 raise. He immediately adjusted his retirement contributions to capture most of that raise, bumping up to about $43,000 a year between his 401k and additional savings. When he finally retired at 66, he had about $2.1 million saved. If he'd kept his old contribution rate of $30,000 a year and spent all his time trying to optimize investment returns, even if he'd managed to beat the market by a point, he probably would have had maybe $1.7 million at best. The simplified approach with maximized contributions beat the sophisticated approach by $400,000. That's the pattern I've seen over and over. People who focus on saving aggressively and investing simply do better than people who save modestly and invest complexly. The first group has the math on their side. The second group is fighting an uphill battle, trying to make up through investment skill what they didn't accomplish through savings discipline. So if you're in your 50s and you're wondering what you should be doing with your investments, here's my answer. Save as much as you possibly can. Maximize those retirement account contributions, especially with the catch-up provisions available after 50. Cut expenses where you can to free up more savings. Push yourself to contribute more than feels comfortable. And keep your investments simple, boring, and low cost. Set it up right, then leave it alone. That's not exciting advice. There's no clever strategy, no secret approach, no sophisticated technique. It's just the steady accumulation of capital through the force of discipline. But it works. And in your 50s, when time is running shorter and mistakes are harder to recover from, focusing on what works matters more than ever. The essential move is behavioral. save more. The move to skip is also behavioral. Stop tinkering. Get those two things right. And the specific investments almost don't matter. You'll end up in good shape regardless of whether the market has a great decade or a mediocre one. Get them wrong, save too little and fiddle too much, and even a great market won't save you. That's what I tell anyone in their 50s who asked. Not everyone wants to hear it because it's not the sophisticated answer they're looking for. But it's the true answer, the one that will actually make a difference in whether they have a secure retirement or a stressful one. And at the end of the day, that's what matters.